Most people think control looks like pressure, threats, or force. It doesn't. Real control feels like comfort. It feels like being certain you're a good person, certain you follow the right rules, certain your choices are morally safe. Because the moment you feel morally secure, you stop asking dangerous questions. And that's the quiet trap. The systems that shape your job, your relationships, even your ambitions don't actually need to restrain you. They only need to reward you emotionally for staying predictable, for staying reasonable, for staying good. More than 2 centuries ago, Arthur Schopenhauer warned that human beings rarely act from pure rational thought. He believed most of our decisions come from deeper hidden drives, and that afterward, we invent moral explanations to make those impulses feel noble. Which means the comfort you feel about your principles might not be proof of your freedom. It might be the mechanism keeping you from noticing who benefits from your obedience. And once you see how that mechanism works, you start noticing it everywhere. Most people grow up believing morality is what keeps the world from falling apart. It's presented as protection, as dignity, as the invisible line separating civilized people from chaos. And on the surface, that sounds true. Rules create order. Values create trust. Shared ideas of right and wrong make cooperation possible. Without them, society would feel unpredictable, maybe even dangerous. But the uncomfortable part is this. What if the psychological comfort of feeling moral matters more to people than the truth of what's actually right? The German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer believed human behavior is rarely guided by calm, rational ethics. In his major work, The World as Will and Representation, he argued that beneath our logical explanations sits something far stronger, a blind internal drive pushing our desires, fears, and decisions long before we justify them with moral language. In other words, people don't always act because something is moral. Often, they decide first and explain later. And that changes everything. Because if morality often comes after the decision, then the feeling of moral certainty may not be guiding your life. It may simply be protecting the story you tell yourself about it. So, before we talk about breaking psychological chains, we first need to understand why the comfort of morality is so hard to question. Chaos terrifies people far more than unfairness ever will. Most viewers assume moral rules exist mainly to stop bad behavior. But psychologically, their deeper function is much simpler. They make the world feel predictable. And the human brain is wired to value predictability almost as much as safety. Imagine 2 environments. In the first, the rules are strict, sometimes unfair, and occasionally limit what you can do. But they're clear. You know how to behave. You know what earns approval. You know what makes you good. In the second environment, you're completely free. No expectations, no moral script. No social certainty about what's right. Every decision is yours alone, and every consequence is yours to carry. Most people claim they want the second world. Almost everyone emotionally chooses the first. Because moral certainty removes a psychological burden most people never realize they're carrying, the burden of responsibility for defining their own values. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer argued that humans are not primarily rational creatures searching calmly for truth. He believed we are driven first by deep internal impulses, fears, desires, survival instincts, and only afterward construct logical or moral explanations that make those impulses feel justified. And this is where moral comfort becomes powerful. If a person can attach their behavior to an accepted moral framework, they instantly gain 3 emotional rewards. First, reduced anxiety. They no longer feel personally exposed making uncertain decisions. Second, social protection. Others recognize and validate their goodness. Third, identity stability. They know who they are within the system. This combination is incredibly addictive because once morality provides emotional security, questioning it stops feeling intellectual and starts feeling dangerous. Think about how often people defend familiar rules, not because they've examined them deeply, but because abandoning them would mean stepping into psychological uncertainty. Without the rule, they must decide. Without the script, they must judge. Without the label of good, they must face the risk of being wrong. And that fear quietly keeps people inside structures they might otherwise challenge. But this is only the surface layer of the mechanism. Because the real leverage of moral comfort isn't just that it reduces anxiety, it's that once someone builds their identity around being good, control no longer needs enforcement. At that point, the system doesn't have to punish them. They start policing themselves. And that's where the trap becomes far more difficult to see. The moment a person needs to see themselves as good, control stops being external. It becomes internal. Because once morality turns into identity, the question is no longer, is this fair? The question becomes, what would a good person do? And whoever defines that answer quietly gains influence over the person asking it. This is where moral comfort stops being a personal belief and starts functioning like a social control switch. Look at how this plays out in modern environments. In many workplaces, the most reliable employees aren't controlled through threats. They're controlled through praise. They're told they're loyal, dependable, team-oriented, professional. None of these words sound restrictive. They sound like compliments. But once someone accepts those labels as part of their identity, something subtle happens. Saying no to unreasonable demands no longer feels like a simple decision. It feels like a threat to who they believe they are. Leaving late suddenly becomes proof of dedication. Accepting overload becomes proof of responsibility. Enduring unfair treatment becomes proof of maturity. And the system doesn't need to force any of this. The person enforces it on themselves. More than 2 centuries ago, Arthur Schopenhauer argued that human beings rarely act from detached moral reasoning. Instead, we are driven by deeper impulses: fear of rejection, need for belonging, desire for security. And afterward, we frame our choices in moral language so they feel justified and dignified. This explains why identity-based morality is so powerful. If a rule is presented as a practical guideline, people may question it. If the same rule is presented as a test of character, questioning it feels dangerous. Because now the risk isn't just making the wrong choice. The risk is becoming the wrong kind of person. And once that shift happens, control becomes frictionless. No surveillance required, no punishment necessary, no visible authority even needed. All that's required is a strong enough emotional reward for feeling morally approved and a strong enough discomfort for imagining moral disapproval. At that point, the system doesn't manage behavior directly. It manages identity. And once identity is involved, people will often defend the structure controlling them, not because they've analyzed it carefully, but because protecting the structure feels identical to protecting themselves. Which leads to the darkest part of the mechanism. Because if morality can shape identity from the outside, there's an even deeper force shaping it from the inside. Even if society never told you what good means, your mind would still try to build a moral story. Because the deepest driver of human behavior isn't logic, it's impulse. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer described this force as the will, a blind, restless engine underneath conscious thought. According to his view, people don't calmly choose their desires after rational analysis. The desire appears first. The explanation comes later. And this is where moral comfort becomes almost impossible to detect, because most people assume their moral reasoning guides their actions. Schopenhauer suggested the opposite. First you want, then you decide. Only afterward do you construct the moral justification that makes the decision feel principled. Watch how often this pattern appears in ordinary life. Someone competes aggressively for status and calls it providing for their family. Someone cuts off a rival and calls it protecting their boundaries. Someone envies another person's success and frames it as standing up for fairness. The emotional impulse comes first. The moral explanation follows so quickly it feels simultaneous. And once the explanation exists, the person experiences something powerful, psychological relief. Because if the action feels moral, it no longer feels selfish. If it feels principled, it no longer feels driven by fear. If it feels justified, it no longer feels like a loss of control. This is why moral comfort is so stabilizing. It turns messy internal drives into clean personal narratives. It lets people believe their lives follow a clear ethical structure, even when their decisions were shaped by forces they never consciously examined. But here's the unsettling consequence. If your brain automatically generates moral stories to protect your sense of identity, then the feeling of moral certainty cannot always be trusted as evidence of truth. Sometimes it's evidence of successful self-protection. And once you notice that mechanism, something shifts. Because the question stops being, "Am I doing the right thing?" and becomes, "What part of me needed this to feel right?" And that question is far more dangerous. Because the moment you start asking it consistently, you stop navigating the world through moral comfort. You start navigating it through awareness. And awareness doesn't remove the system's influence, but it does something far more disruptive. It makes the invisible chains visible. Here's the part most people never consider. What if moral comfort doesn't just make you easier to control? What if it's also the thing your own mind uses to control you? Because the disturbing implication in the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer isn't simply that society shapes your beliefs. It's that your consciousness itself may be designed to protect emotional stability before it protects truth. Think about what that means. If a belief makes you feel morally secure, socially accepted, and internally consistent, your mind has every incentive to keep that belief intact, even if reality contradicts it. Not because you're weak, because psychological stability is survival. A person who suddenly doubts their moral framework doesn't just lose an opinion. They risk losing their sense of identity, their social belonging, and their confidence in their own judgment all at once. That's not a small intellectual adjustment. That feels like existential danger. So the brain does something very efficient. It filters information. It softens contradictions. It reinforces the narrative that keeps the internal world stable. Which means the strongest chains aren't enforced by governments, bosses, or institutions. They're enforced by the quiet internal voice that says, "Relax, you're doing the right thing. Stay where it feels safe." And the twist is this: the moment that voice feels most comforting, that's often the moment you should question it the most. By now, you should feel it, the invisible weight of moral comfort pressing against your awareness. It's subtle. You might have thought it was protection, guidance, even virtue. But Schopenhauer warned that what feels most secure is often what keeps you confined. The rules, the labels, the approval you cling to, they aren't just external pressures. They're internal chains you willingly reinforce every day. Here's the real challenge. Noticing them is only the first step. Once you see how easily your mind manufactures moral narratives to protect itself, you start to question everything. Every should, every right, every story you've told yourself about who you are and why you do what you do. That questioning is uncomfortable, disorienting, even frightening. But it's the path to real autonomy.
So here's what I want you to do. Start observing where moral comfort may be guiding your choices without your conscious permission. Ask yourself, am I acting because it's right or because it feels safe? The moment you confront that, you begin to dismantle the invisible chains around your mind. If this unsettled you, don't just walk away. Hit subscribe and the bell to uncover more hidden patterns shaping human behavior.
Comment below with one belief you suspect may be controlling you. The more honest, the better. And don't forget to watch the next video, where we'll expose the silent forces behind social obedience that you've been blind to your entire life. Because here's the scariest part. The system isn't just outside of you. It's been inside you all along.